The Five Dysfunctions of a Team, a Leadership Fable. Written by Patrick Lencioni. Summarized by detailed book summaries. Don't forget to subscribe. Chapter 1. Luck. Sometimes, leadership stories don't begin with a crisis. They begin with a change, a shift, a quiet transfer of power that sets everything in motion. That's how we meet Catherine Peterson, the new CEO of Decision Tech, a struggling startup in Silicon Valley that once promised brilliance, but was now slowly unraveling from within. The chapter opens with an almost misleading calm. Catherine is not flashy. She doesn't come from a high-tech background. She's a 57-year-old veteran from the manufacturing sector, a place far removed from Silicon Valley's young, hoodie-wearing entrepreneurs. And yet, the board chose her, not for her charisma, not for her tech know-how, but for one thing, her ability to build teams that actually function. Decision Tech was bleeding potential. The company had more funding than most, top-tier engineers, a celebrated product concept, and a modern downtown office. From the outside, it looked like the next big thing, but from the inside, it was chaos. Meetings were unproductive. Politics ran deep. The executive team barely trusted each other. Everyone was smart, but nobody was aligned. When Catherine took the helm, no one quite knew what to expect, especially not the executive team. Most of them were younger, sharper in tech credentials, and skeptical of her old-school approach. But Catherine wasn't interested in proving herself. She was interested in something far more important, fixing the team. And she started doing that with something most leaders overlook: observation. For the first 2 weeks, she watched. Quietly, patiently, she sat in meetings, listened to conversations, took notes, and absorbed the subtle dysfunctions pulsing beneath every interaction. There were power struggles, passive aggressiveness, defensiveness. But above all, there was something else, a deep lack of trust. And that's where Lencioni begins laying the foundation of his model. In his storytelling style, he doesn't break into theory yet. He lets us feel the dysfunction before he names it. We begin to see the cracks forming, not because someone did something catastrophically wrong, but because no one was truly together. It wasn't a matter of competence. It was a matter of cohesion. Catherine noticed it quickly. She could see that her team didn't engage in real conversations. People guarded their words. They avoided conflict in meetings, but whispered frustrations afterward. Goals were unclear. Accountability was missing. And results? Everyone talked about them, but no one took full ownership. She knew this wasn't a product problem. It wasn't a market problem. It was a team problem. And she was going to fix it, not by micromanaging or throwing out directives, but by taking them through the hard work of becoming a real team. The beauty of this first chapter lies in its simplicity. It reads like a slow inhale before the deep dive. Catherine doesn't deliver a fiery speech or launch a company-wide overhaul. Instead, she listens, and that patience speaks volumes. Because great leaders know something that many miss. You can't lead a team until you understand its dysfunctions. By the end of the chapter, we realize this isn't just going to be a fable about business. It's going to be a story about people, about egos, fears, miscommunication, and most importantly, transformation. And that transformation starts with one leader asking a difficult question: what's really getting in our way? In the next chapters, we'll follow Catherine as she breaks down the dysfunctions one by one. Trust, conflict, commitment, accountability, results. Each one stacking on top of the other like a fragile tower. And if even one piece is missing, the entire structure collapses. But for now, in this first quiet moment, we are left with a sense of tension, not explosive, but simmering. And the realization that Catherine's greatest challenge isn't turning the company around, it's turning the people around. Because as Lencioni will show us, teams don't fall apart because of lack of intelligence. They fall apart because of something deeper. Chapter 2, Underachievement. On paper, Decision Tech should have been killing it. They had the product. They had the people. They had more funding than most startups could ever dream of. They even had early buzz from the press. But behind the doors of their stylish downtown office, something just wasn't clicking. The numbers told the story: flat growth, slipping morale, and an uncomfortable silence between once enthusiastic investors. They had missed critical milestones. Deadlines passed with little explanation. Finger pointing was subtle but present. Everyone was looking at everyone else, wondering where the breakdown was coming from. And yet, no one looked inward. Catherine could feel it, not just in the boardroom meetings, but in the hallways, the lunches, the offhand remarks from team members when they thought no one was listening. This wasn't just underperformance. It was underachievement, and it ran deep. The potential was enormous. But the team? It was stuck. And part of the problem was that no one wanted to admit it. At her first official executive meeting as CEO, Catherine stepped into the room with her calm, unassuming presence. She wasn't there to impress them. She was there to confront a reality they had been dodging. They expected product roadmaps, revenue targets, maybe even a speech about disruption. But Catherine didn't deliver that. Instead, she looked around the room and said, "We are underachieving." Silence, not just a pause. A silence thick with discomfort, with defensiveness, with a creeping feeling that someone had just turned on the lights in a room that had been dark for too long. Catherine wasn't trying to humiliate anyone. She was stating the obvious, but something the team had been too proud or too afraid to say out loud. Her tone wasn't aggressive. It was direct, honest. She wasn't blaming individuals. She was holding up a mirror to the system, to the team dynamic that had allowed underachievement to feel normal. Some of the executives squirmed in their chairs. Others looked away. Jeff, the head of sales, tapped his pen restlessly. Mikey, the head of marketing, rolled her eyes almost imperceptibly. Jan, the CFO, stared straight ahead, unreadable. But Catherine saw all of it. She wasn't just reading their faces. She was reading the trust level, or lack of it, in the room. And that's when the real work began. Catherine didn't talk about new KPIs. She didn't promise magical growth hacks. Instead, she challenged the team to face reality together, to acknowledge that while they were smart and skilled and well-funded, they were not functioning as a team. And if that didn't change, nothing else would. Over the next few days, her presence began to unsettle people. Not because she was loud or controlling, but because she was still watching, still listening, and not playing into the usual tech leadership hype. She started meeting with each team member individually, not to micromanage, but to understand what made them tick, what they feared, what they wanted, and more importantly, how they interacted with each other. It didn't take long to see the pattern. There were silos. Department heads operated independently, rarely checking in with one another unless it was for damage control. Conflicts were avoided, or worse, handled through back channels and passive-aggressive emails. Decisions were made in small cliques instead of as a unified front. There were alliances and cold wars simmering beneath the surface. Catherine knew these weren't bad people. In fact, they were good, smart, passionate, and ambitious. But they had never learned how to be a team. And because of that, the organization's intelligence was fragmented. The brilliance of each department was canceled out by the dysfunction between them. That's what underachievement really looks like. It's not laziness. It's not stupidity. It's misalignment. It's a group of high performers rowing in different directions, each believing they're doing their best, while the boat spins in circles. And so, Catherine began to prepare for the first off-site meeting. Not a typical corporate retreat, filled with fluffy team-building games or strategy slides. This was going to be something much deeper and far more uncomfortable. She was going to walk this team through the dysfunctions they were too proud to acknowledge. She was going to hold them accountable, not just for their departments, but for each other. Her goal wasn't to teach them management theory. Her goal was to build a team from scratch, right there in a company that had already been built around them. By the end of the chapter, you can feel the weight of the challenge settling in. Catherine isn't a turnaround artist. She's a truth teller. And what decision tech needs more than innovation or capital is clarity. The kind of clarity that only comes from facing what's broken and deciding together to fix it. And so begins the hard part. Not the product, not the marketing, not the execution, but the people. Because, as Lencioni will soon show us, teams don't rise by getting smarter. They rise when they finally decide to get real. Chapter 3, the offsite. It was still dark outside when Catherine arrived at the offsite facility, a quiet retreat center tucked into the rolling hills outside the city. The rest of the team would be arriving soon, but she needed a moment to walk the grounds, breathe the morning air, and center herself for what was about to unfold. Today was not just another meeting. It was a reset, a reckoning. The team had been told this was mandatory. 3 days, no laptops, no phones, no distractions. Just them face-to-face in one room. That alone created tension. These were busy executives, or at least they told themselves they were. But Catherine knew the real resistance wasn't about time. It was about discomfort. Because deep down, they sensed this wasn't going to be a strategy session. It was going to be a mirror. They arrived one by one. Nick, the CTO, looked skeptical. Mikey, the head of marketing, radiated sarcasm before even taking her seat. Martin, who led operations, looked annoyed but polite. Jan, the CFO, was quiet as always, composed to the point of unreadable. Jeff, the head of sales, paced the room like he'd rather be anywhere else. Carlos, in customer support, seemed open, maybe too open, eager for clarity in a place that had lacked it for too long. Catherine began with a simple statement. We are not here to fix the company. We are here to fix the team. If we do that, the company will fix itself. Silence. She wrote 5 words on a flip chart. Absence of trust. Fear of conflict. Lack of commitment. Avoidance of accountability. Inattention to results. Then, without explaining them, she turned and looked around the room. These, she said, are what's holding us back. This is not a theoretical model. It's the reality of what I've observed over the past few weeks. And whether we like it or not, we're going to talk about them. You could almost hear the team's collective resistance harden. The idea that they, the smartest, most experienced people in the building, might be dysfunctional was a bitter pill to swallow. But Catherine wasn't here to play games. She started with trust, not the surface level, I like you kind of trust, but the kind that allows people to be vulnerable, to say, I messed up or I don't know, without fear of judgment or career suicide. That kind of trust was non-existent in the room, and everyone knew it. She asked each person to share something about themselves, their background, their biggest challenge growing up, something real. At first, it felt forced, robotic, but one by one, the walls began to crack. Martin shared about his father's high expectations. Jan revealed the pressure she had faced as the only woman in a male-dominated finance department early in her career. Even Mikey, usually flippant, spoke about the weight she carried trying to prove herself in a role many thought she didn't deserve. That morning, the mood began to shift. The room didn't soften exactly, but became more honest. Vulnerability didn't dissolve the tension. It made it visible and manageable. Catherine didn't lecture. She listened. She asked questions. She let silence hang in the air when it needed to. By the afternoon, they were no longer strangers in departments. They were people, flawed, complex, and more alike than they realized. Then came the next dysfunction. Fear of conflict. Catherine didn't dance around it. You avoid the hard conversations, she said, and when you do that, the real problems don't get solved. They just mutate into gossip, resentment, and confusion. She played back examples, subtle comment from meetings, tension-laced emails, decisions made outside the room. She wasn't there to accuse anyone. She was there to name the patterns. And as uncomfortable as it was, the team couldn't deny the truth in what she said. Jeff crossed his arms. Mikey pushed back. We disagree all the time, she said. Catherine raised her eyebrows. Disagreeing isn't the issue, she said. The problem is no one's willing to fight for the best idea. You all settle too quickly, or worse, stay quiet and fume later. The room went still. This was the heart of it, the disease beneath the dysfunctions. A team so focused on looking like a team that it had forgotten how to act like one. Real teams argue. They debate. They challenge each other. They risk hurting feelings because they care more about the outcome than their own comfort. That night, there were side conversations. Some frustrated, some reflective, but all of them circling the same idea. Catherine wasn't tearing them down. She was showing them who they had become. And she was offering them a choice. Keep pretending everything was fine, or start doing the hard work of rebuilding trust, embracing conflict, and becoming the team they were meant to be. Not by reading another business book, not by posting company values on a wall, but by changing how they showed up with each other every day. This offsite wasn't going to be the end of the dysfunction, but it was the beginning of the fight against it. And Catherine had just lit the match. Chapter 4, The Model. Morning light poured to the tall windows of the off-site conference room, casting long shadows across the polished floor. The room felt different. Something had shifted overnight. Not in any dramatic way, but enough that people sat a little straighter, made more eye contact, said less but meant more. Catherine took her place at the front of the room. There was no PowerPoint, no opening joke. Just her, a flip chart and a diagram, a triangle. Simple, 5 layers stacked from bottom to top. She circled the bottom and looked up at the team. This, she said, is why we're stuck, and it's how we're going to get unstuck. She called the 5 dysfunctions of a team, and for the first time, she laid them out plainly, without preamble or softening. Absence of trust, fear of conflict, lack of commitment, avoidance of accountability, inattention to results. One by one, she walked through them, not like a lecturer, but like a guide leading them into a structure they'd already been living inside without knowing it. The base of the pyramid, the foundation, was trust, not predictive trust. I know what you'll do, but vulnerability-based trust. The kind that says, I'm willing to admit I'm wrong, or I need help, or I screwed that up. Without that kind of trust, nothing else worked. If we don't trust one another, Catherine said, we can't have healthy conflict. And without conflict, we won't get true commitment. Without commitment, we avoid holding each other accountable. And when that happens, results stop being the focus. Personal agendas take over. You could see the realization start to sink in. This wasn't a list of concepts. It was a diagnosis. She was holding up a mirror, and the reflection was clear. Catherine paused and then added something unexpected. This model is not mine. It's not a magic formula. It's a description of what functional, high-performing teams actually look like. The dysfunctions are just what happens when we avoid the hard parts of working together. She didn't name names. She didn't have to. They all recognize pieces of themselves in that pyramid. Mikey, the queen of guarded sarcasm, heard the trust piece loud and clear. Jeff, who dodged confrontation by staying silent in meetings and grumbling afterward, squirmed at the word conflict. Jan, who never wanted to rock the boat, visibly blinked at commitment. And accountability? That one landed hard on everyone. Because when results aren't the focus, when no one's being held accountable, what creeps in instead is ego, departmental wins, personal protection, a need to look good rather than do good. But Catherine wasn't here to shame them. She was here to equip them, to give them a structure that didn't just identify the problem, but showed a way forward. She explained how each dysfunction built on the previous one. Without trust, there's no safe space for debate. Without debate, decisions become lukewarm, watered down to whatever feels safe. Without clear, passionate commitment, no one feels the right to call out a teammate who's slipping. And when that culture becomes a norm, the results, the very thing the company exists for, start to fade into the background. But she also gave hope. She made it clear that the pyramid didn't just describe failure. It outlined a path to health. Teams that build trust can engage in productive conflict. Not yelling, not politics, but real, unfiltered dialogue about ideas. That kind of conflict leads to clarity and buy-in, which creates commitment. Once everyone's bought in, holding each other accountable doesn't feel like an attack. It feels like care. And when people hold each other accountable, the team starts to focus on what truly matters: collective results. Catherine looked at the group and said, "We are going to rebuild this team, layer by layer. But it has to start with you being real with each other. Not polite, not professional, real." Then she handed out a one-page summary of the model and asked each person to rate where the team currently stood on each dysfunction. Quietly, they filled it out. The numbers were sobering. Trust? Low. Conflict? Almost non-existent. Commitment? Patchy at best. Accountability? Mostly avoided. Results? Everyone said they cared, just not together. No one needed a spreadsheet to see it. They lived it every day. And now they could name it. That was the power of the model. It didn't invent dysfunction. It simply gave people language to see it and the structure to do something about it. Catherine closed the session with this. Our dysfunction is not unique. What matters is whether we choose to fix it. And I'm here to help you do just that. If you're willing to show up. And for the first time, no one looked away. Chapter 5, Trust. The next morning, the air in the off-site room felt denser. Not with hostility, but with something more uncertain. Vulnerability was on the menu, and everyone knew it. They just didn't know what it would taste like. Catherine stood by the easel, uncapped marker in hand, and tapped the base of the pyramid she'd introduced the day before. Absence of trust. This is where we start, she said. Because if we don't trust one another, nothing else we build will hold. You could almost feel the emotional recoil in the room. Trust, real, exposed, uncomfortable trust, wasn't something they were used to. They weren't enemies, but they weren't safe with each other either. They smiled in meetings. They nodded at updates. But beneath the surface, they guarded their thoughts like secrets. Everyone wore armor, and Catherine was asking them to take it off. But she wasn't going to force it. She was going to guide it. She began by explaining that trust isn't about predicting someone's behavior. It's not about liking them or assuming they'll follow through. It's deeper, more raw. It's about the willingness to be vulnerable, to admit mistakes, to ask for help, to say, I don't know, or I'm scared, or even, I was wrong. Then she dropped the bomb that would kickstart the session. We're going to share something personal about where we come from, not job titles, not resumes, something real. One by one, she asked them to talk about their childhoods, the biggest challenge they faced growing up, what shaped them, what hardened them, what broke them. Martin, always stoic, went first. He shared about moving constantly as a kid, how never having roots made him cautious, reserved. It wasn't a dramatic story, but it was honest. Next came Carlos, who talked about growing up in a loud, crowded household where being heard meant being the loudest. Jeff talked about being pushed by his father to succeed, never hearing, good job, unless it was the best job. Mikey, rolling her eyes at first, eventually confessed how working in male-dominated spaces forced her to act tougher than she felt. Jan revealed the fear of not being enough. Nick shared how perfectionism had always been his safety net. And Catherine? She went last. She spoke about a career shaped by being overlooked, dismissed, underestimated, and how it taught her to listen more and speak less. Not because she didn't have ideas, but because she learned that trust is built slowly, by showing up consistently. What happened in that room wasn't dramatic. No one cried. No one had a breakdown. But something shifted. Walls began to crumble. Because once you've heard what someone carries with them, it's harder to treat them like a competitor. You stop assuming. You start empathizing. You don't have to agree with them, but you begin to see them. Catherine knew that vulnerability isn't a tactic. It's a discipline. And like any muscle, it needs exercise. So she didn't just stop at story sharing. She encouraged them to start behaving differently, to take more risks in conversation, to stop pretending they had all the answers, to admit when they messed up. The team had been living in self-preservation mode. Now, they were being asked to live in relationship mode. And trust doesn't mean there's never conflict. In fact, as Catherine explained, real trust leads to real conflict. Because now you're no longer afraid to challenge ideas or speak your mind. When you trust that the other person won't use your weakness against you, you can finally stop performing and start contributing. It would take time. Catherine knew that. This wasn't a 2-day transformation. It was the beginning of a new culture. And culture, like trust, is built by consistent behavior, not slogans. She left them that afternoon with a simple question. What would this team look like if no one felt the need to pretend? There was no formal answer, just quiet reflection. And for the first time, perhaps ever, they weren't thinking about how to look smart or stay safe. They were thinking about how to be real. and that Catherine knew was the real foundation of a high-functioning team. Chapter 6, Conflict. Trust was the first wall to crack. But as the team soon discovered, the space it left behind didn't feel peaceful. It felt tense. Because once you start telling the truth, once trust lays the groundwork, conflict walks through the door next. Catherine didn't ease them into this one. She walked straight to the next dysfunction on the pyramid. Fear of conflict. She tapped the board, circled it once, and then turned to the team. "I'm going to say something that might make you uncomfortable," she began. "If there isn't conflict on this team, real, passionate, messy conflict, then we are not making the best decisions we can." A few raised eyebrows. Mikey folded her arms. Jeff shifted in his chair. Martin looked down at the table. Conflict? That was a bad word. Something to avoid. Something to smooth over or bury under fake smiles and watered down feedback. But Catherine was saying the opposite. That avoiding conflict was hurting them. That their fear of confrontation was keeping them stuck in mediocrity. She could already see their resistance. So she gave them examples, small but telling. Times when people stayed silent in meetings, even when they disagreed. Times when a decision was made and half the team nodded outwardly while secretly venting in private. Times when the room was quiet not because there was agreement, but because no one wanted to speak first. That silence, Catherine said, is killing us. She explained that teams who trust each other don't avoid conflict. They embrace it, not to be cruel or combative, but because they care about getting things right. And getting things right means having hard conversations. It means disagreeing, challenging assumptions, calling out flawed ideas, debating, defending, and digging deep. And here's the paradox. When conflict is healthy, it doesn't damage relationships. It strengthens them. But decision tech had built a culture where comfort trumped candor, where peace meant avoiding offense, even if it came at the cost of clarity. People walked on eggshells. Departments defended their turf. And the meetings? They were filled with polite nods, scripted updates, and no real dialogue. So Catherine decided to stir the pot. She handed out red cards to each team member and said, "Today, we're going to argue, not yell, not attack, but argue on purpose." She brought up a real decision they'd been avoiding, a major marketing direction that had quietly stalled due to disagreement between Mikey and Carlos. Both had danced around it for weeks, offering vague statements and safe opinions. But today, Catherine pushed them into the fire. "Mikey," she said, "why do you think Carlos's approach won't work?" Mikey blinked. For once, no snark, no sarcasm, just hesitation. But Catherine waited. And slowly, Mikey began to explain, not perform, not defend, but explain. Carlos responded, not by shutting down or retaliating, but by clarifying his intent. Catherine watched as the discussion began to warm up, then boil, faster now, sharper. Tension rose. People leaned in. Others joined. Questions flew. And then something remarkable happened. For the first time in weeks, the team felt alive, engaged, challenged. They were finally wrestling with the real issues instead of sidestepping them. There were raised voices, a little frustration, even some awkward moments. But there was no malice. No one stormed out. No one shut down. And by the end, they reached an actual decision together. Catherine smiled, not because it was perfect, but because it was progress. Conflict had happened, and the company didn't burn down. In fact, it felt stronger. That afternoon, Catherine made one thing crystal clear. Conflict is not a problem. It's a sign of commitment. The only teams that don't argue are the ones where no one cares enough to push for better. She gave them a new standard, not agreement, but engagement. If everyone in the room agrees too quickly, something is wrong. Either the issue isn't important enough, or people are hiding their real thoughts. From now on, silence would be a red flag. Disagreement would be welcome. And if meetings felt a little uncomfortable, that meant they were finally getting somewhere. Conflict wasn't chaos. It was clarity. And Catherine was ready to lead them through all of it, if they were brave enough to keep showing up and telling the truth. Chapter 7, Commitment. There's a myth in business that commitment comes from consensus. That everyone has to agree before a team can move forward. Catherine knew better. She had seen too many smart teams paralyzed by the pursuit of unanimous comfort. And at Decision Tech, that myth had been running the show for far too long. Now, after cracking open trust and engaging in real conflict, it was time to confront the next dysfunction: lack of commitment. She began that morning with a question: how many decisions have we delayed, watered down, or abandoned because we were afraid of pushing through disagreement? The silence that followed was less defensive than before. It was contemplative. Jeff spoke first, slowly, probably more than we'd like to admit. Exactly. Catherine explained that commitment doesn't require everyone to agree. It requires everyone to be heard. And once people have been heard, even if the final decision isn't what they personally preferred, they're far more likely to support it. Clarity and buy-in, she said. That's what we're after. Not perfection. Not consensus. Clarity. And a willingness to rally behind a decision, even when it wasn't your idea. She pointed to a list on the board. Decisions a team had been stuck on for weeks. Product launch timelines, hiring plans, pricing strategies. All stalled because the team had never truly committed. They had left meetings with vague language. We'll circle back. Let's keep talking. We'll wait and see. But no one ever owned the decision. No one ever stepped out of the room saying, "This is what we're doing. Let's go." It was a pattern of avoidance masquerading as collaboration. So Catherine walked them through a simple but powerful tool: the cascading messaging model. At the end of every meeting, the leadership team would agree on one thing. What exactly are we going to communicate to our teams, and how will we say it? No more leaving meetings with different versions of the same decision. No more passive-aggressive updates. No more hedging. The goal was alignment, and that required commitment, even in disagreement. To illustrate, Catherine revisited the marketing debate between Mikey and Carlos. Though the team had ultimately gone with Carlos's plan, Mikey hadn't undermined it afterward. She didn't roll her eyes in meetings or downplay it to her staff. Instead, she said, "It wasn't my preference, but we talked it through. We made a decision, and I'm on board." That, Catherine explained, was what commitment looked like. It wasn't enthusiastic agreement. It was disciplined unity. She reminded them that high-performing teams often argue vigorously, but they always leave with shared clarity. And they don't revisit decisions endlessly. They commit, execute, and adjust later if needed. The cost of inaction, she told them, is far higher than the cost of a wrong decision. She also brought up the power of deadlines, not just for deliverables, but for decisions. Too often, decision tech waited for perfect information before moving forward. But in a fast-moving industry, perfection was a luxury they couldn't afford. Make the best call you can, she said, and then commit to it like it was your own. That day, they made 3 key decisions they had been sitting on for months. The debate was lively. The opinions were varied, but they left with unified clarity. No caveats. No conditional support. It felt good. Unsettling, but good. As they wrapped up, Catherine left them with this: commitment doesn't mean everyone's thrilled. It means everyone is responsible. When we commit, we stop playing small. We stop waiting. And we start leading. Because in the end, teams don't fail because they choose the wrong path. They fail because they never choose one at all. Chapter 8, Accountability. By now, the team was evolving. Not perfectly, not smoothly, but visibly. They had peeled back layers of armor and shown pieces of themselves. They had argued, really argued, for the first time in years. And they had started making decisions with more speed and clarity than ever before. But Catherine knew the next dysfunction would be the one most teams stumbled over. It wasn't dramatic like conflict. It wasn't conceptual like trust. It was more personal. Avoidance of accountability. She stepped in front of the room and simply asked, "When someone on this team drops the ball, who calls it out?" Silence. She followed up, "What if it's not your department? What if it's awkward or small? Do you say something?" More silence. This was a dysfunction no one wanted to admit to, because it wasn't about broken systems. It was about courage. Catherine explained that the strongest teams aren't just led by one person enforcing standards. They are self-governing. On high-performing teams, peers hold each other accountable, not with malice, not with superiority, but with expectation. The expectation that everyone will bring their best and that no one will be allowed to quietly slide by. Accountability, she said, is the highest form of respect. You hold people accountable not because you enjoy it, but because you believe they're capable of more, because you care more about the mission than avoiding discomfort. At Decision Tech, this hadn't been the case. Not because the team was lazy or careless, but because they were polite. Too polite. Jeff hadn't confronted Mikey when marketing missed a key deadline. Nick never pushed back when product updates were late, as long as the blame could be deflected upward. Jen, even when she spotted inefficiencies or misaligned priorities, rarely said anything outside her domain. They all waited for Catherine to do the uncomfortable work. But that, she said, had to stop. Accountability, she told them, can't be outsourced to the boss. Not if we're going to be a real team. She introduced a simple structure, peer-to-peer accountability. From now on, if someone saw a teammate slipping on performance, behavior, attitude, they had a responsibility to say something. Not after the meeting, not through a passive-aggressive comment, but directly, respectfully, quickly. They practiced. Catherine had them role-play actual examples from the past month, moments when someone had let something slide. Jeff had to tell Martin how his slow operations updates affected sales. Mikey had to address how her team's mixed messaging was frustrating Carlos's support staff. Jan had to speak up about a decision she had disagreed with, but never voiced. At first, it was clumsy, awkward. Some comments came out too soft, others too harsh. But with each round, the edges smoothed out. The discomfort became purpose. They started to see that accountability didn't have to feel like punishment. It could feel like alignment. Catherine stressed that accountability wasn't just about performance. It was about behavior. If someone dominated a meeting, didn't listen, broke commitments, or showed up late, it was everyone's job to say something. Not because it was personal. Because the team mattered more than the individual ego. And the best part? Catherine didn't have to say it all herself anymore. She watched as Jeff gave Mikey a look when she tried to dodge responsibility. As Martin corrected a misleading data point before Jan even had to say a word. As Nick stopped himself mid-sentence and said, "Wait, I think I was about to throw someone under the bus." That was growth. They were becoming accountable not just to results, but to each other. And Catherine reminded them, when accountability is real, performance skyrockets, not because people fear consequences, but because they're surrounded by a team that refuses to let them fall short. And that, she said, is how you know you're not just working with people, but working for something bigger than yourself. Chapter 9, Results. The final tier of the pyramid sat at the very top. Simple in shape, but heavy in consequence. Inattention to results. Catherine stood in front of it, marker in hand, and let the weight of the words settle in the air. This, she said quietly, is where all the other dysfunctions end up. Because a team that doesn't trust one another won't have healthy conflict. Without conflict, they won't commit. Without commitment, no one will hold each other accountable. And without accountability, there's no focus, no urgency, no ownership, just noise, just motion, just individual agendas masquerading as teamwork. Catherine had seen it too many times. And now, she was seeing it here at Decision Tech. She clicked the cap back on her marker and stepped aside. Let's talk about what results we're actually focused on, she said. Right now, today, as a team. Jeff leaned back, arms crossed. Revenue, obviously. Martin chimed in. Operational efficiency. We need to cut costs. Carlos added, customer satisfaction is key. That's how we retain accounts. Jan threw in profit margins. Nick said, product quality and innovation. Catherine let them go on for a moment before cutting in gently. All of those are good. But let me ask you, whose results are those? A pause. She pushed further. Are they the company's results or your department's results? No one answered. And that was the truth she wanted them to see. The problem wasn't that people didn't care about results. It was that they each cared about their own results. They were rowing, but in different directions. Jeff wanted sales numbers. Mikey wanted marketing wins. Jan wanted the budget under control. Nick wanted cleaner code. Carlos wanted lower churn. And each of them, in their own way, had become more loyal to their silo than to the company's collective success. Catherine took a breath. What if I told you that hitting your individual targets while the company fails is actually failure? She walked over to the whiteboard and wrote 2 words. Team results. This is what matters now, she said. We don't win until this wins. She explained that great teams subordinate individual needs and departmental priorities for the sake of collective goals. When you focus on team results, the scoreboard changes. You stop hoarding information. You stop fighting for credit. You stop making excuses when another department stumbles. Because on a real team, you only win when everyone wins. To drive the point home, Catherine challenged him to define one unifying metric, a clear objective that everyone in the room would be held accountable for. One result they'd all live and die by, regardless of role. After some heated debate, and yes, more healthy conflict, they landed on a quarterly revenue milestone that was both ambitious and urgent. Then came the hard part. Catherine asked, "Are you willing to sacrifice something in your department if it helps the team hit this number?" They went around the table one by one. Jan nodded. "If I need to release more funds for customer retention, I'll do it." Jeff said, "If sales needs to ease up to improve onboarding quality, we'll adjust." Mikey agreed to refocus a campaign even if it meant shelving a project or team had already sunk weeks into. It was a small shift in words, but a massive shift in identity. They were starting to think like a team. And Catherine knew, from years of experience, that teams who truly care about results don't just measure numbers. They hold each other accountable for what matters most. They celebrate wins together. They take losses together. And they leave their egos at the door. In the coming weeks, the shift became visible. Meetings were tighter. Decisions came faster. Accountability became normal, not awkward. And people stopped saying my team and started saying our team. It wasn't magic. It was discipline. Catherine closed the session with this. Remember, the enemy of team results isn't failure. It's distraction. It's the moment when you stop thinking like a team and start thinking like a division. If we lose that, if we lose each other, we lose the game. And just like that, the pyramid was complete. Trust, conflict, commitment, accountability, results. Not a theory, not a nice to have, but the blueprint for becoming something rare. A team that actually works. Chapter 10, the turnaround. Change never announces itself with trumpets. It creeps in slowly, reshaping the air, the habits, the way people look at each other across the conference table. And at Decision Tech, that change had begun to take root, not as a performance, but as a process. In the weeks that followed Catherine's final lesson on results, the team started living differently, not perfectly, but deliberately. The Monday morning meetings no longer felt like status updates or carefully choreographed routines. People came ready to challenge, ready to listen, and most importantly, ready to decide. Gone were the days of nodding in public and resisting in private. The conversations became sharper, more direct, even uncomfortable at times. But they were real. Trust had been built. It wasn't just in their words, it was in their silence, too. The kind of silence that didn't come from fear or confusion, but from respect, from people thinking before they spoke, from giving others space to own the floor. Conflict, once the elephant in the room, was now expected. No one flinched when a disagreement flared. No one took it personally when someone pushed back. They understood that passion was a signal of commitment, not chaos. And commitment? It showed up in how they followed through. When the team made decisions on pricing, product features, strategy, they stood behind them. Even if it wasn't their preferred idea, they owned it, together. Then came the accountability. It was subtle at first. A quick side note in a meeting, a private Slack message. But gradually, it became part of their DNA. If someone missed a deadline or dropped the ball, they didn't wait for Catherine to step in. They handled it. directly, calmly, professionally. Accountability wasn't just tolerated. It became a badge of trust, a sign that someone believed in you enough to call you up, not just out. And it worked. Results started to shift. Projects picked up speed. Sales improved. Communication between departments finally felt aligned. Morale climbed, not because things got easier, but because things finally made sense. Everyone was rowing in the same direction. Even Catherine, who had come in as the outsider, started to fade into the background, not because she was less important, but because the team no longer needed her to be the conscience in the room. They had internalized the model. They had become what she always knew they could be, a real team. Still, she watched carefully. She knew dysfunction doesn't die. It waits. It lurks in silence, in ego, in exhaustion. One skipped hard conversation, one overlooked behavior, one moment of passive approval. That's all it takes for cracks to reopen. But this team was different now. They had scars, yes, but they also had structure, and language, and trust. At her final debrief with the team, Catherine stood before them and said, "This isn't the end. It's the new beginning. Dysfunction doesn't disappear because you've conquered it once. You have to choose health. Every single day." She pointed back to the pyramid one last time and said something they'd never forget